I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland. Free and uncorrupted communication.
I think this topic we're talking about, truth or consequences, certainly what I'm going to be talking about is consequences of certain ideas, because ideas do have huge impacts. And certainly if we think about 20th century history, which I teach a course in 20th century Europe I'm teaching right now, we can see the consequences of ideas that have gone astray. We see the consequences of Nazism, for example, and the Holocaust, some of the issues that I deal with in my research. But we also see Stalinism, Marxism, the impact of that's had on the world. So I think it's worth thinking about some of these issues and to realize that these really are serious matters that affect people's lives and affect people's deaths. I have entitled my talk From Darwin to Hitler, which is the title of my book, but I've also given it an alternate title, which is Does Darwinism Devalue Human Life? And this is going to be one of the key issues I'm going to talk about. And I admit that the title of my presentation, which is also the title of my book, is controversial, and I hope it will stir up some healthy controversy. However, I also need to clear up some possible misunderstandings from the very start. First, nowhere do I argue that Darwinism leads inevitably to Hitler, that there's a logical necessity there, or to the Holocaust. To state the obvious, neither Darwin nor most Darwinists are Nazis. Okay, so we need to clear that away from the very start. In fact, in my book, I don't even really discuss, I don't even really make a philosophical argument. I make a historical argument about looking at how Darwinists themselves applied the ideas of Darwinism. So this isn't my philosophical spin on what Darwinism should imply or might imply or even must imply. Rather, I'm saying this is how Darwinists looked at Darwinism and its implications for human life and human death. I actually state in the very introduction that the readers themselves need to try to think about what the logic is of these Darwinian thinkers. Now, I happen to think there is a certain kind of logic to it, but whether one agrees or disagrees with that viewpoint, and whether one agrees or disagrees with these Darwinists who I'm going to talk about who did devalue human life, the historical impact of their ideas on Western culture has been immense. And that's what I want to focus on today. Actually, though, I'm also in this presentation going to go a little bit beyond the material in my book by going on and talking about some of the contemporary Darwinist thinkers who are likewise making some of the same kinds of moves that the people I investigated did. Most of my work was in the late 19th, early 20th century Germany. But there are also contemporary American and British and German thinkers today that are saying similar kinds of things. And so I'm going to try to make explicit how these things do relate to contemporary debates on bioethics. A second point that I want to make before I get going is that when I began my research, I didn't begin trying to link Darwin with Hitler. I did my dissertation on the impact of Darwinism on German socialists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And as I was doing that, I became interested in evolutionary ethics because I noticed that a lot of these German thinkers were writing about ethics and trying to set up and trying to promote some kind of evolutionary ethic. When I first started this research, I wasn't even thinking about Hitler. In fact, and I was a little wary of that because there's a book by a scholar named Daniel Gassman who's not taken very seriously by most historians, who does try to draw a very direct line from Ernst Haeckel, who was the leading German Darwinist, to Hitler. And he does it in ways that don't really make a lot of sense. And I agree with a lot of the criticisms that have been leveled at him. So I was a little wary of making that kind of connection. Nonetheless, I obviously did make the connection, ultimately. And I believe it was a case of being driven there by the empirical data that turned up time and again and brought me to the point where I made the connections, but I think in a much more subtle and more truthful way, perhaps, than Daniel Gassman had. There were two reasons that I made this sort of unexpected turn in my research. First of all, as I began studying evolutionary ethics in late 19th century Germany, I started finding out that German eugenicists were in the forefront of talking about evolutionary ethics. And I hadn't realized that until getting underway with my research somewhat. And so I better say just a little bit about eugenics, because that's one of the themes in my book. And it has a big bearing then on what I'm going to have to say here. Francis Galton, here's a biography of him, is considered the founding father of eugenics. Eugenics was a movement that was very prominent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to try to improve human heredity. Galton got that idea, by the way, in part from reading Darwin's Origin of Species, by his own admission. Darwin was his cousin, and he imbibed Darwinian ideas. And in fact, all of the German eugenicists likewise argued very strongly that their ideology was based upon Darwinism. In fact, there was a fear among many of these eugenicists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that because modern culture, especially modern medicine, was undermining natural selection by allowing the, quote, unfit to survive and reproduce, that this was producing something of a problem. And so the way to get around the problem of the deterioration or degeneration, as the term was used quite often in the late 19th, early 20th century, the way to get around that problem of degeneration was to use artificial selection. And so this is then what eugenics was all about, trying to use some way of artificially selecting humans to produce, to get away from degeneration, and hopefully also to then improve the human species and to direct human evolution. So this is one reason then, the issue of eugenics, that began driving me in the direction of my research. The second issue was in 1995 I offered a seminar called Darwinism, Religion, and Society. And in that seminar we discussed a book by James Rachels. And that book was called Created from Animals: The Moral Implications of Evolution. As we began discussing this book in the seminar, two very bright students in that seminar said that they believed that Darwinism proved moral relativism. Well, that caught my attention, and so I decided to give them a sort of concrete example to see how far they were willing to drive that. And I said, so, okay, what about Hitler? What about Hitler? Was he evil? Was he, what would you say about him? And without batting an eye, they said, correct. He was neither good nor evil. They wanted to drive the moral relativism as far as it would go. I was rather horrified by that, of course. So that got me thinking in certain ways about Darwinism and moral relativism. Then the second thing about Rachel's book is that Rachel's whole argument is that Darwinism undermines the Judeo-Christian concept of the sanctity of human life. And so that got me thinking about some of these German Darwinists that I'd read about, who had, some of them had similar kinds of ideas. And for example, one of them that I already knew about at this point was Ernst Haeckel, who was the leading Darwinist in Germany in the late 19th century and on into the early 20th century. And Haeckel had, already in 1870, proposed infanticide for those with congenital illnesses, especially mental illnesses. So I moved back into my research with this question then: does Darwinism devalue human life, or at least do Darwinists think that Darwinism devalues human life? And I started investigating then these Darwinist thinkers using that question. And that question is very controversial. Does Darwinism devalue human life? There are many Darwinists who will say that Darwinism doesn't have anything to do with ethics or morality. They'll invoke what's called the naturalistic fallacy, which states that you can't get from is to ought. And they will call Hitler's invocation of Darwinism, they'll sometimes call it vulgar Darwinism or distorted Darwinism. I've heard those various terms. However, whatever the philosophical argument one wants to make about that, the plain fact of the matter is historically that many leading Darwinists did, and still do today, believe that Darwinism does have strong ethical implications. Darwin himself did, by the way. And there were actually many of them who expressed positions very close to Rachel's own position. And so my research then sort of underlines this train of thought and the implications, or rather the consequences that it had. Now, I want to talk then about what some of these implications are. And when I say this, the implications of Darwinism for devaluing human life, this is not just my own philosophical spin. I'm giving you what Darwinists themselves are saying about Darwinism. Now again, not all Darwinists are going to agree with this, I acknowledge that, but nonetheless there are many Darwinists who do buy into these particular ideas that I'm going to put forward to you tonight. First of all, human inequality. Evolution requires variation. There has to be biological variation for evolution to occur. And many scientists argued, especially in the late 19th century, that that meant that humans are unequal biologically, and they very often spelled that out into all sorts of anti-egalitarian kind of thinking. Ernst Haeckel, for example, wrote several essays that were strongly anti-socialist, claiming that the socialists were unscientific because they believed in equality of humanity. And he said, no, science proves the inequality of humanity. And he wasn't the only one. There were a number of Darwinists who wrote very strongly against the socialist movement because of this issue of human equality. If you look at the eugenics literature is replete with examples of people talking about human inequality. The word inferiority occurs again and again and again and again in eugenics literature. They're concerned about the inferior, and you'll see this in some of the slides I'm going to show you in a little bit here too. Just to give you one concrete example, Hugo Ribert, who was a medical professor, I believe it was at the University of Bonn, wrote in one of his books on eugenics, quote, and this is, again, a fairly similar statement to many other eugenicists, too. This is not just sort of off-the-wall, fringe stuff. This is mainstream medical professor eugenics ideology. He said, "The care for individuals who from birth onwards are useless alike, mentally and physically, who for themselves and their fellow creatures are a burden merely, persons of negative value, is a function altogether useless to humanity, and indeed positively injurious." I mean, he used some pretty strong language there to make clear, words, they're a burden, they're negative value, useless to humanity, and injurious. Those were common ideas at the time about those who had hereditary illnesses, especially mental illnesses. Now, there were two ways that this inequality could work, and it did work this way, in fact, in the Darwinian scene in the 19th and early 20th centuries. First of all, within society. Okay, here I have a picture that comes from a book by a prominent psychiatrist in Germany in his 1903 book about criminal anthropology, where he shows the allegedly ape-like features of an Italian criminal. This is based on Cesare Lombroso's ideas. Lombroso was an Italian psychiatrist who founded what's called criminal anthropology, and he believed that criminals were a throwback, an evolutionary throwback, and thus he thought they would have physical features that were more like apes. And so the sloping forehead, the nose, that was considered ape-like characteristics that these criminals allegedly had. And there were also other Darwinists talking the same thing about mental illnesses, talking about how people who had mental illnesses were evolutionary throwbacks to ape ancestors and simply didn't have some of these human capacities because they were re-emerging their ape things. So here we see then within society there's this inequality, and especially it had to do with the mentally ill and criminals. And by the way, psychiatrists were on the forefront of the eugenics movement. They were really one of the driving forces in the eugenics movement. But not only would it apply within society, it also applied across societies, especially dealing with race. We were just discussing over dinner here about Darwin's own ideas, and Darwin did himself believe in the inequality of races. However, Ernst Haeckel, the leading Darwinist in Germany, was even more radically inegalitarian in his racial scheme. Here is a frontispiece to his very popular book, Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, which means Natural History of Creation. And in that, he has 12 pictures here. And you notice the top one here is Indo-European. And then we have Asians, Mongol race, they called it at the time. Going down here to number 6, which is an African, a black African. And then notice number 7, then you start the primates. These first 6 pictures here are of human races. These next ones are primate species. And the caption to this particular illustration claimed that the distance between the highest human, that's number 1 here, and the lowest human, number 6 here, is higher, or bigger rather, than the distinction or difference between the lowest human and the highest primate. And notice how similar those are in facial features and such. The idea is here, these are real close, and these are further apart. You have actually 6 steps to get to here, and then just 1 step to the primate there. And he actually wrote that in the caption. In fact, Haeckel at one point claimed that the difference mentally between the lowest human and the highest human was greater than the distance between the lowest human and even a dog or an elephant. Haeckel also divided the human races into 12 species. Not only that, but he divided those 12 species into 4 distinct genera. So that's how inegalitarian he was in his racial scheme. And this is not totally unusual. Haeckel was extremely influential, for one thing, and won a lot of people over to his ideas. But there were many Darwinists preaching similarly this racial inegalitarianism. And here's an illustration to show that this hit the popular front as well. Here's a popular magazine in Germany with some German, this is during World War I, 1916. Here's some German soldiers, and they have captured a black African troop. The French used black Africans on the Western Front. And so here they've captured a black African troop, and they says, "Man, you're bringing him to Hagenbeck, aren't you?" Hagenbeck was very famous in Germany for his zoo collections that he made in many parts of Germany. He said, "Man, you're bringing him to Hagenbeck, aren't you? He can't catch better gorillas in Africa than we can on the Western Front." And so again, we see the dehumanizing aspect here of this inegalitarianism as it's being practiced. And it's being practiced both relating to the races, but also toward individuals within a particular society. Okay? Second point, in addition to human inequality, we have moral relativism undermining human rights. And this is a prominent theme in many Darwinian thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Darwin himself admitted that this was a consequence of his own views. In his autobiography, he wrote that one, quote, "can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones." Now, to be sure, Darwin, with his Victorian optimism, believed that the best and strongest instincts would be social instincts, as he called them, which would lead to the golden rule. He thought that morality was built into the human species, biologically, instinctually, and so he had optimism that this would lead to altruistic kind of behavior. But what if it didn't? What if someone had different instincts? He basically didn't have any leverage morally to tell them that, that was good or that was bad. It's just follow the instincts which are strongest and seem the best ones. This was not an uncommon idea once again. A famous philosopher at the University of Vienna named Friedrich Jodl, who edited the International Journal of Ethics, a very prominent journal in his field. He's an internationally renowned ethicist. Likewise argued in an essay that because of Darwinism, morality was relative and changed over time, and therefore argued we needed to reform morality, and argued we needed social reform as a result of that. There were quite a number of thinkers, in fact, who argued against universal human rights based on Darwinian ideology. Okay, that's my second point. My third point is the animal ancestry of humans. was another key issue that was going to have big ethical implications relating to human life. Darwin argued that the difference between humans and their primate ancestors was a matter of degree, not of kind. It was, to use his words, he said it's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative difference. So this blurs the distinction then between humans and animals. And so you have here a picture that's in one of Ernst Haeckel's books. Again, Haeckel plays a pretty prominent role in my study since he was the leading Darwinist in Germany and wrote a lot of best-selling works. In his 1911 edition of the same work that I pulled that frontispiece out of earlier, he has a piece here that shows an alleged missing link, of humans. So you see the sort of facial features there looking sort of half primate, half human there. This kind of thinking, by the way, has led today to ideas of charges by animal rights activists of speciesism and such, because there's no clear line between species for Darwin, and that includes humans and their closest animal ancestors. Associated with some of these ideas, an idea that might not strike you at first until you think about it more, would be the denial of body-soul dualism. Darwin himself was trying to bridge the gap between animals and humanity. And in doing that, Darwin wanted to explain all human faculties as the product of purely natural processes. And the things that had been traditionally explained in his day as being part of the human soul or the human spirit, such as morality, which again it plays a big role in my work, but also religion and other kinds of functions, aesthetics. These things, Darwin wanted to explain them all as product of natural processes. And many other Darwinists agreed. In fact, one of the most striking cases I found of this was Auguste Forel, who was a world-renowned psychiatrist at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, who, as a young man, read Darwin's Origin of Species and immediately became convinced. In fact, he describes this in his autobiography in the terms of almost religious conversion experience, that suddenly the lights went on and he understood that there was no such thing as a human soul, and because of Darwin's theory. And he went out after that and studied ants and ant social behavior and such, and then eventually became a psychiatrist, a leading psychiatrist in the world, and became one of the leading figures in the eugenics movement, winning over some of the main German eugenicists. There were also many others in the Darwinian camp who were struggling against the idea of body-soul dualism. Ernst Haeckel, whom I've mentioned a number of times already, in 1906 founded an organization called the Monist League. And he called his philosophy monism. And what that was meant to do was be a direct contradiction to dualism. And he fought against any kinds of dualism, Judeo-Christian most prominently, since that was the most prominent worldview around in his day, but also against Kantian dualism, any kind of dualism he was opposed to. And he believed that his Darwinian outlook had destroyed the notion that there could be any kind of human soul separate from the body. Okay, fifth point. The human struggle for existence. This was another key aspect of Darwinian thinking that was going to have big implications for the value of human life. Darwin had explained that as organisms multiply, they multiply far faster than they can survive. And this imbalance, which was based on Malthus' population principle — Malthus had been a thinker who had posed a problem of the superfecundity, or the over-reproduction of species, and Malthus focused specifically on humans. Darwin got his idea about struggle for existence and natural selection while reading Malthus, and then had to explain this situation where you have all these organisms being produced but not reaching reproductive age, which means there's mass death taking place throughout the biological world, And Malthus, of course, was specifically talking about human society, so certainly this is applying to humans as well. Now, this idea of the human struggle for existence, competition for scarce resources, because there's more people reproducing than can possibly exist according to Malthus and then also according to Darwin, could also take place on two levels, just like the inequality issue. It can take place, the struggle for existence can take place within a society. So people within a society, individuals, are having to struggle among themselves and have scarce resources. So the way this worked itself out, here's a eugenics poster from Germany. I think this was done during the Nazi period, in fact, and the title of it is The Threat of the Subhuman. And there on the top you have this is a male criminal, it says. And the male criminal has 4.9 children. And then here you have a criminal marriage, it says, 4.4 children. Then here you have in this middle diagram, you have parents with children in special education. Okay? And they have 3.5 children with them. And then down here you have the average German family. And they're having 2.2 children. And then here you have an academic family. And they only have 1.9 children. And the lesson is that in this struggle for existence, the wrong people are winning out. It's the criminals and the mentally, quote, substandard are the ones who are winning out in the struggle for existence, so we need to rectify this situation. And the eugenics was the way to try to rectify this situation for many of these Darwinian thinkers. Okay, here's another one. It's not just Germany that this is going on. Here's one from the United States. This is a display that was put in many fairs throughout the United States. The American Eugenics Society had booths at county and state fairs throughout the United States in the early 20th century where they pushed for their ideas relating to population. And you see here on the left, it says some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And then here below it says America needs, and then it says less of these, and it has here on the left a light blinking. It says that light blinks every 48 seconds on the left. And it says every 48 seconds a person is born in the United States who will never grow up mentally beyond that stage of a normal 8-year-old boy or girl. Okay? So we need less of those. And then on the right side it says America needs more of these. And here you have a light flashing. It says this light flashes every 7.5 minutes. It says every 7.5 minutes a high-grade person is born in the United States who will have ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. Now notice the disparity here. Okay, on the left you have every 48 seconds. Here it's only every 7.5 minutes. Again, this is designed to generate your fears of human degeneration that's going to take place because more of these, quote, unfit people are being born than of the so-called fit. Okay, so again, a similar kind of idea. Notice again the inegalitarianism here, which we already talked about earlier, people being a burden on the right, trying to figure out how to correct these kind of problems that they have. Okay, so that's how the human struggle for existence would take place within society. But then human struggle for existence also takes place between societies. Here's a diagram from a book by a man named Friedrich Helwald, who was a prominent German ethnologist who wrote a book called The History of Culture. This is from the 4th edition in 1896. His first edition was in the 1870s. And he was highly regarded by his colleagues, but his whole account of the history of culture is an attempt to try to show how the Darwinian struggle for existence applies to human history. And this he gives as one example, and he says in the text that this is an example of the human struggle for existence. The Spaniards up here are letting their dogs loose on the American Indians, and Helwald says this is just a natural process that takes place. It's just part of the human struggle for existence. And so, thus, justifies this kind of scene as he depicts it here. Now, Helwald was not the only one to put forward ideas similar to this. In fact, Darwin himself put forward ideas about racial extermination. Darwin wrote to a colleague saying that, quote, "The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world." He also said in The Descent of Man, so in a published work, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." This was a very prominent and fairly common idea among Darwinists in thinking about their inegalitarianism and then the struggle for existence resulting in extermination and death for those who were considered unfit or less fit. Okay, my sixth point then. That was the human struggle for existence. Now, sixth point. Darwinism viewed death in a whole new way than had certainly traditional Judeo-Christian thought. Darwinism saw death as producing progress. After all, the human struggle for existence is producing greater complexity in organisms. And so he saw death as being an engine driving the evolutionary progress. And although Darwin, by the way, some note that Darwin didn't really believe in teleology, and there are times when he says he doesn't believe in his work promotes the idea of progress, but actually he uses words of progress throughout The Origin of Species and Descent of Man. And just one quote that I think illustrates this. In The Origin of Species, Darwin says, "Thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows." This, by the way, is a secular theodicy. Theodicy means a justification of evil, a justification of God in the face of evil. Of course, it's a secular one because it's pushing God out of the picture, but it's justifying natural evil by claiming that a higher good gets produced by natural evil in the world. This was a very common idea as well. Friedrich Helwald, who I just showed you the slide on with his History of Culture, said in that History of Culture that humans, quote, the fitter humans rather, quote, "stride across the corpses of the vanquished. That is natural law." Okay, so here we have a scientific justification for the death of the vanquished in this human struggle for existence. Now, this took place not only in terms of racial extermination, which I've just talked a little bit about, but it also took place on other levels. There were quite a number of Darwinian thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th century who used Darwinian thinking to justify abortion, to justify infanticide. I already mentioned Ernst Haeckel there, and also euthanasia. And in these two books that came out fairly recently, the first one on the top there by Ian Dalbiggin, he's at the University of Prince Edward Island, his book A Merciful End, The Euthanasia Movement in Modern America, and then also Nick Kemp, Merciful Release, The History of the British Euthanasia Movement. I should say, too, that these two guys ideologically are poles apart. Dalbiggin's a little skeptical toward euthanasia, whereas Kemp is very supportive of euthanasia. Both of them admit that Darwinism was a key point in the conversion of people toward euthanasia, and that leaders in the early euthanasia movement in America and in Britain were very influenced by Darwinian thinking. Dalbiggin said this, quote, "The most pivotal turning point in early history of the euthanasia movement was the coming of Darwinism to America." So he said that was the most important point ideologically in winning people over to euthanasia. Nick Kemp largely agrees with that assessment, saying, quote, "While we should be wary of depicting Darwin as the man responsible for ushering in a secular age, we should be similarly cautious of underestimating the importance of evolutionary thought in relation to the questioning of the sanctity of human life." So again, admitting that this is an extremely important part in stripping away the sanctity of human life was the Darwinian theory and subsequent worldviews that were being built upon it. Now, I think the importance of this perhaps goes without saying in many ways. in my own work, I've looked at how this has led into Nazi ideology. And in fact, as I told you at the beginning, I wasn't really even thinking about Hitler when I began my study. It's only as I began studying some of these eugenicists and what they had to say about the value of human life that I even began to think about Hitler and to realize that, yeah, what Hitler was saying is very close to what some of these other people have been saying that I've been studying here. So here, just to give you one quote, is, "There is a place in humanity for murder, that is to say, by killing the unfit." Sounds a lot like Nazi ideology. Next one. "Chloroform unfit children. Show them the same mercy that is shown beasts that are no longer fit to live." That sounds a lot like Nazi ideology, but these guys weren't Nazis that wrote this. The top quotation is from Havelock Ellis, who was a prominent physician and sex reformer, a progressive in early 20th century Britain, and wrote quite widely on sex reform at the time. And eugenics, by the way, was an ideology that was not the province of the right wing, as sometimes it's been caricatured. Eugenics ideology was very, and scholars acknowledge this pretty much across the board, was very popular with the left as well, and progressives. In fact, the very earliest eugenicists were themselves progressives. Some of them called themselves socialists even, or at least were sympathetic with socialism. But not with the, I should say, not with Marxism, because they weren't egalitarian. This second one here about chloroform the unfit children, this comes from Clarence Darrow, the American who was the defense attorney at the famous Scopes trial relating to Darwinism. He was defending Darwinism at the Scopes trial there. And he was also then a prominent supporter of infanticide and euthanasia based on his Darwinian thinking. And again, notice the word unfit is in both of those quotations as well, showing the connections there with the Darwinian kind of thinking. Now, I think what this has to do with Hitler is probably fairly obvious. I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. If you want to read more about it, the last chapter of my book talks about Hitler and his ideas. In fact, the last chapter is called Hitler's Ethic, which is not an oxymoron, by the way. A lot of people think that that's sort of contradictory, Hitler's Ethic. In fact, I actually gave a talk one time at a university where I laid out the table of contents for my book. And the last chapter on Hitler's Ethic, one of the persons in the audience in question and answer time quipped and said, "Well, I guess that last chapter is going to be kind of thin, huh?" And I said, "Oh, on the contrary, I think Hitler did have some very coherent, albeit pernicious, moral views." And in fact, very interestingly, the very day that I sent my manuscript off to my publisher, the very final manuscript last July, I received an email from someone telling me about a work by Claudia Kuntz at Duke University with Harvard University Press that just came out called The Nazi Conscience. And her work, in fact, corroborates a lot of what I say about Hitler and his particular views, at least that he has a coherent ethic. She doesn't argue for the Darwinian angle. However, she doesn't really talk about the antecedents at all. So my work actually fits together kind of nicely with hers, in fact. But I think what it has to do with Nazis is pretty obvious. But here's a Nazi poster to sort of make a little more explicit here what we're talking about. This Nazi poster sounds a lot like the one I showed you earlier of the American Eugenics Society at the fairs and such. 60,000 marks is what this mentally ill person costs the national community in a lifetime. Comrades, this is your money too. And once the Nazis came to power in July 1933, just 6 months after they came to power, they passed a law of compulsory sterilization for those who were considered mentally or physically handicapped, especially those who were institutionalized. And they carried this program on extremely vigorously, sterilizing several hundred thousand. In fact, they sterilized half the population. 0.5% of the population of Germany was compulsorily sterilized in their sterilization program. Then when World War II broke out, they began a so-called euthanasia program. Now, but this was not voluntary euthanasia. This was the murder of the mentally and physically handicapped who were institutionalized, which began in October 1939 and was carried out in 6 killing centers located throughout Germany, in which they killed about 70,000 mentally and physically, mostly mentally, but also some physically handicapped people. And this is considered by many scholars the first step of the Holocaust. In fact, there's a book called The Origins of the Nazi Holocaust by Henry Friedlander, in which he argues that the euthanasia campaign was the opening salvo in the Nazi Holocaust. There was a close connection between these eugenics ideas and his racial ideas. The inequality was simply on a different level there. But you might ask then, okay, these ideas were around in the late 19th, early 20th century. We see that Hitler bought into ideas about social Darwinism and such, but didn't the demise of Nazism bring about a death or deal a death blow to eugenics ideology, to ideas about racial extermination, Darwinian racism, and such? Yes, in many ways it did. The word eugenics itself came into disrepute after the Nazi period, partly because of what the Nazis did. That wasn't the only factor, but it was one important one. But nonetheless, Darwinian devaluing of human life continued to occur simply in different kinds of ways. And now I want to jump just a little bit and move on to the contemporary scene, to show you that this is not just something that was taking place back 50 to 100 years ago, but it's something that's still an issue today. First of all, oops, wrong one. Here we go. Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a very prominent philosopher. He's at Princeton University now. He's from Australia. And interestingly, his parents fled the Nazi Holocaust. But he's been accused very often of having Nazi kind of ideas because of his devaluing of human life. Now notice on the left book there, the Darwinian left, I was trying to bring up something here to illustrate that Singer is very committed to Darwinian ideology, and he believes that the left or the progressives need to incorporate Darwinian thinking into their political ideologies, and that's what that book is about. But then on the right, you see his book, Rethinking Life and Death, and this is more of what Singer is actually known for. Singer is known for his bioethics, and particularly his stance favoring voluntary euthanasia, as well as infanticide for infants who have mental and physical handicaps of various sort. Now, Singer does draw a very direct correlation between Darwinism and the sanctity of human life, or I should say the undermining of the sanctity of human life. Singer claims in one of his essays, it's not in either of these books actually, it's in a different book, but he argues that Darwinism, quote, gave what ought to have been its final blow, quote closed, to the sanctity of life ethic. So he says Darwinism should have destroyed Judeo-Christian idea of the sanctity of human life. Now he admits that it hasn't. Judeo-Christian sanctity of human life ethic is still persisting, but he wants to give it the death blow now through his philosophy. Singer not only promotes infanticide and voluntary euthanasia, he's also very strongly into animal rights, which is also part of the issue of speciesism that I mentioned earlier. The blurring of the distinctions between the human species and other animals fits right in to that. Now, Singer's not alone. There are many other thinkers also who are promoting, Singer's, I should say, is one of the more radical of them, but there are also many other thinkers that are promoting similar kinds of ideas about Darwinism and its connections to the devaluing of human life. This one by Daniel Dennett, who's a prominent materialist philosopher in the United States. His book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, Evolution and the Meanings of Life. In that book, he argues that Darwinism acts like a universal acid, dissolving all other ideologies, all other ideas, especially religion, and also ethical ideas, though. And he does spend a good deal of time talking about ethics in that book, although there are a lot of other issues that he raises as well. In his talking about ethics, he does briefly discuss the issue of the value of human life. It's not a major theme in the book, but it does get discussed. And he says that there are, quote, gradations of value in the ending of human lives. Well, if there are gradations of value and ending of human lives, this also implies, at least to me, that there are gradations of value of human life. And in fact, he goes on to say, in thinking about sort of concrete steps here, he goes on to ask, which is worse, taking heroic measures to keep alive a severely deformed infant, or taking the equally heroic, if unsung, step of seeing to it that such an infant dies as quickly and painlessly as possible? Okay, so again, here is a not very veiled promotion of infanticide for children that have some kind of deformity of sorts. So again, we have a similar kind of idea percolating here in Daniel Dennett's book. And so apparently Darwin's dangerous idea is especially dangerous to the mentally and physically handicapped. And that universal acid apparently eats away at them most. Okay, let me stop there for a second. Okay, another key figure today is Richard Dawkins. He's probably one of the most famous Darwinists in the world today at Oxford University. In an article in 2001, and there are many other places I could look for this too, but I thought this one was especially interesting. In 2001, he wrote an article in which he advocated genetic engineering to try to produce a missing link, if you will. He wanted to try to produce something as close to an Australopithecine as possible to get back. He even called her a Lucy. Okay, so he wants to get back to a missing link. Now, why would he want to do that? And in fact, he even says he sort of thinks that maybe he would feel sorry for such an individual, such an organism. I don't know what he would call it, sort of half human, half animal, I suppose. He said he would sort of feel sorry for him because it would probably be put in shows and such and be shown off. But he said he nonetheless thinks it would be a great idea to do it because he says he thinks that it would help destroy our speciesist illusion. And the speciesist illusion is the idea that there is a significant distinction and difference between humans and other animals. And so he says if we could bring on this missing link, if we could produce it genetically, figure out genetically what that must have been, try to track that back, produce it through genetic engineering, then we can show the fallacy of any kind of sanctity of human life. In that same essay, I should remark also that Dawkins also expressed the desire that if he ever got, quote, past it, that he would be euthanized. And some people probably think Dawkins is already past it. But fortunately, I hope at least that most of those also believe in the sanctity of human life, and so they won't help him out in his request. Well, there are many others, and I could go on here, but maybe just suffice it for one more example, contemporary example, and that's James Watson. Again, he's the most famous geneticist around today. He co-discovered the helix model of DNA back in 1953 with Crick. He then became head of the Human Genome Project when it was started in the early 90s, 89 to 90. And has had a huge impact on the field of genetics. He builds his worldview very forthrightly on Darwinian naturalism. I don't know if any of you saw Watson in the PBS special on genetics that was out like in January, I think, but he talks quite extensively about Darwinism and the way that it undermines the idea of design and such. He makes, in fact, quite a number of startling statements in that. Watson has never learned to mind his mouth, has never been known for his tact. He's created a lot of enemies that way, too. But Watson proposes a new eugenics. He doesn't use that word very often. The word eugenics is still a little bit too much disrepute. A lot of times people say new genetics instead of eugenics. But actually, the word eugenics is actually getting a little bit of a comeback in the last few years. And people are beginning to be less abashed about using the term eugenics in contemporary discourse. And he very forthrightly argues for human inequality and biological inequality in that PBS special that focuses on him and his ideas about new eugenics. And they're talking about different aspects of human genetic engineering and such to try to get rid of. And by the way, there's a really interesting clip, by the way, in that PBS special where Watson is talking about, he says, the lower 10% of people in elementary school. and he's talking about how they are inferior. He doesn't use the word inferior, but that's the point that he's making there. And he actually says, as he's going through that, talking about these 10% of people, he says, we need to find a way to get rid of, to help out these people who are in the lower 10%. And when I heard that, he sort of stumbles over it a little bit, and I actually had to replay that about 10 times to really listen to exactly what he said and how he said it. I mean, he really does say we need to get rid of, and then I forgot what the exact next two words are, but he sort of stumbles a little bit, and then he says, help out those who are in this lower 10%. But if you listen to the rest of the video, he's talking very forthrightly about, quote, getting rid of those with various kinds of physical and mental hereditary illnesses. Well, in 1973, before we had a lot of the genetic technologies we have, especially diagnostic technologies, Watson actually proposed that we allow parents to kill their infants after birth because we couldn't figure out at that time, and you'll see this in the very top part of this, I've got the slide up here. Watson said in 1973, because of the present limits of such detection methods, meaning of genetic illnesses, well, now he doesn't have that problem because they can detect a lot of them. Not all of them, of course, but they can detect a lot of them now, so he's pushing abortion very strongly now. But at this time, he said, because of the present limits of such detection methods, most birth defects are not discovered until birth. If a child were not declared alive until 3 days after birth, then all parents could be allowed the choice. There's that word choice again. We hear so much in our society. The doctor could allow the child to die if the parents so choose and save a lot of misery and suffering. Okay, let me close by considering the question then. In light of all of this, does Darwinism really devalue human life? I think I've shown conclusively that historically, Darwinism has indeed devalued human life, leading to ideologies that promote the destruction of human lives deemed less valuable or unfit. Those on the forefront in promoting abortion, which I haven't talked about much tonight, but if you look back at the early abortion movement, you see Darwinian arguments cropping up quite strongly as well. Ernst Haeckel made arguments for abortion based on, matter of fact, let me mention that real quick because I think that's a really interesting one. Ernst Haeckel argued that from conception, a person is a distinct human individual. But he was promoting infanticide even. So he said that because they were still going through lower stages of evolutionary development in their earlier embryonic stages, it was okay then to abort them, especially if they were possibly going to have some genetic, or hereditary would be the word at that time, hereditary illness. But those in the forefront promoting abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and racial extermination often overtly based their ideas on Darwinism. Also, as I've shown here, those favoring a Darwinian dismantling of the sanctity of life ethic do have a good deal of intellectual firepower, both then and today. And the idea is becoming rather widespread in our society, as well as other parts of Western culture. There are, of course, various religious and philosophical moves that someone could make to evade these conclusions, and some Darwinists have in the past, and some still do today, vigorously oppose these kinds of developments of devaluing human life. And for this we can be thankful. They construe them often as faulty extrapolations by overzealous Darwinian materialists, perhaps. However, it still does seem to me that there is some kind of inherent logic in the move that these Darwinists are making in undermining the sanctity of life ethic. And if you think about those 6 points that I raised, I think there is a certain kind of logic to that, whether one agrees with that move or not, that does make this a very alluring view. And so I really doubt that this kind of view of Darwinian devaluing human life is going to disappear as long as Darwinism is ascendant. Because Darwinism has such profound implications for our views of humans and what it means to be human, and human nature, life, and death, it seems to me implausible to maintain that Darwinism can be fully disentangled from ethics or religion. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, who passed away recently but was one of the most prominent Darwinian biologists or paleontologists in the world, argued that Darwinism and science on the one hand, and religion and ethics on the other hand, are completely separate, totally divorced, having nothing to do with each other. He called this his view of the non-overlapping magisteria. So they don't overlap at all in any way. But even he failed to keep them apart when push came to shove and when he began writing. In his book, just to give one example, he has a book out called Wonderful Life, The Burgess Shale and the Nature of History. And in that work, Gould argues for the contingency of history. That is, chance events drive history. It's not programmed in. As a matter of fact, he specifically says that if you replayed the tape of life, humans probably wouldn't exist. The closing words of his book, however, show that he wasn't really able to keep things separate the way that he thought he could. Let me read to you just the very closing words to Wonderful Life. And so, if you wish to ask the question of the ages, why do humans exist? A major part of the answer, touching those aspects of the issue that science can treat at all, must be because Pikaia, which is a Burgess Shale chordate that he talks about in the book, because Pikaia survived the Burgess decimation. This response does not cite a single law of nature. It embodies no statement about predictable evolutionary pathways, no calculation of probabilities based on general rules of anatomy or ecology. He goes on, the survival of Pikaia was a contingency of just history. I do not think that any higher answer can be given, and I cannot imagine that any resolution could be more fascinating. We are the offspring of history and must establish our own paths in this most diverse and interesting of conceivable universes, one indifferent to our suffering, and therefore offering us maximal freedom to thrive or to fail in our chosen way. Now that is just dripping with religious and ethical content. And he's claiming that he's drawing it from science, from the contingency of history. In fact, the very title of his book that tells us the Burgess Shale and the nature of history should give us a clue that he is making a philosophical argument here that goes way beyond what science, at least his version of science, just tell me the facts, should be able to give us, especially given his own view that science and ethics don't overlap at all. Whatever one's stance on Darwinism, then, I think it's certainly safe to say that Darwinism has had a tremendous influence on ethical and moral ideas in the modern world. Specifically, it has contributed to the erosion of the sanctity of life ethic, and I'd close by saying that Darwinism really is a matter of life and death. Thank you.